Hey everyone, it's Susan Pierce Thompson and welcome to the weekly vlog. I am about to answer a question from a gal named Annie. And Annie writes in and says, "Hi Susan, how come if and when I break the bright lines, I feel sick, like a hangover, when there are no alcohol or drugs involved? This has not happened to me cheating on other diets or restricted eating plans, even if alcohol, no drugs for me, was involved. What gives? Thanks, Annie." Great question, Annie. I have certainly experienced that as well, and I know many others have as well. A fabulous, full-on hangover after a big fat binge. And what I gotta say is there are drugs involved. I've been saying this all along. Sugar and flour are drugs. Now, there's really good evidence for that. And it's interesting because in some ways, right now, science is sort of in an infantile state around this. It's sort of the beginnings of the emergence of food addiction. I mean, food addiction certainly has been a hot button idea for quite a long time, well over a decade. And Yale University, the Rudd Center, held this this big symposium thing. I think it was in 2006, something like that, where they got researchers and clinicians from all over the world to talk about food addiction as a concept and was it a viable or valuable construct, etc. Anyway, what's interesting is there is sort of a schism where you find that the people in academia who totally accept food addiction and say, yeah, are the researchers in addiction, because they look at the brain and they say, it's the same thing. As a matter of fact, sugar is worse than cocaine. So it's the people who do research in addiction that have no doubts. The people that don't like the idea of food as an addiction are actually the nutritionists and the eating disorder specialists, because in the eating disorder treatment world, these are clinicians, they are used to working with bulimics and anorexics and binge eaters who have a lot of bright lines for themselves, but not the bright lines we have. They have whatever their bright lines are. And in treating them and helping them get over their food addiction, often those clinicians take an approach of trying to convince them that there's no bad foods and that they should eat everything in moderation and that food is not the enemy and so forth. And to them, the idea, the construct of food addiction, they feel like it's taking steps back for so many people who have food issues. Okay, so I'm not going to get into that controversy, but just saying, I obviously side with the brain scientists and the addiction experts who say food is addictive, like no question. Sugar, flour, addictive, no question. Now, what you're saying, Annie, is that you have in the past cheated on your diet, which I know, I love that you put that in quotes, by the way, cheated on your diet, because of course that's not how we think of things in Bright Line Eating land, and not had the hangover. So what I want to propose to you is that your system wasn't clean. Like if you're drinking and then you drink a little more one day, you might not have as bad of a hangover as you would if you got your system totally clean and then had a few drinks. Do you see what I'm saying here? So for me, the analogy would be caffeine. I, right now, don't drink any caffeine at all, not even decaf. If I have a cup of coffee, I am feeling that for the next 24 hours, probably even 2 days, I'm feeling that. Now, I can get to the point with caffeine, I know because I've done it in the past, where I can get to the point where I could drink 2 cups of coffee, at 11 o'clock at night and then go right to sleep. Like I am juiced with caffeine so much and my brain and body are so acclimated to it that I don't even feel it. So my guess, Annie, is that the difference is that when you do Bright Line Eating, your system gets clean. And then when you go off your plan, you have a hangover the next day because you're introducing drugs back into your system. Yes, food is a drug. And I think that one realization that sugar and flour are drugs, bona fide drugs. We have taken plant-based substances and refined and purified them into a fine white powder, the same way we refine and purify the inside of the coca plant the coca leaf into cocaine, and we refine and purify the inside of the poppy plant into heroin. We refine and purify the inside of wheat or rice or soy or whatever into flour. And we refine and purify the inside of corn or beet or sugarcane into sugar. We are taking wholesome plants and turning them into drugs. It's a refining process that we do with the other drugs that we create, and we have created drugs. And yes, when you ingest them on a clean system, they will give you a hangover the next day. Absolutely. But I think this one real kind of turnaround of our thinking, that these foods that are so ubiquitous in our food supply are drugs, is really the foundation of the whole bright line eating movement. I mean, this is what we're about, is saying, okay, so if those are drugs, then those of us who are highly susceptible need to have a plan of attack and a plan of coping and a plan of action. Like, what are we going to do? We're surrounded by drugs, and it's why we can't lose weight, why our brain is blocking us from losing weight, and we can't control ourselves sometimes when it comes to food. We have every intention to have a moderate amount, and we find ourselves eating too much. We have every intention of sticking with a healthy regimen, and 6 months later we're no thinner or we're even heavier. What is going on here? Well, it's the same insidious, mind-numbing process that happens with drugs, where we're duping ourselves, and we have, this saboteur that lives in our minds that tries to trick us into eating more than we intended or eating off our plan or whatever, and all of a sudden, there we are again, overweight and miserable. So the key is to recognize drugs are drugs, and for some of us, an approach of abstinence is the sanest approach. If we're a 2-pack-a-day smoker, we don't need to figure out how to moderate our nicotine consumption. We need to quit smoking. So enter the bright lines. And of course, none of us can stick with bright lines on our own. That's why we need a system. We need a proven process called bright line eating, and all of the tools and disciplines that go with it. So, Annie, I encourage you to look at all of the things around the Bright Line Eating program that allow us to stick with the bright lines, because we can't do it on willpower. We've got to have a system for taking the load off of willpower. And that's what Bright Line Eating describes, is how do you take the load off of willpower? And just to remind you, some of the basics are planning your food the night before, writing it down in a little food journal, committing it to someone, having an emergency action plan. These are all things I go into a ton of detail about in the Bright Line Eating Bootcamp. If you want to go watch old vlogs, and I talk about a lot of these topics along the way as well, but there's an entire system for being able to stick with bright lines in the face of a food supply that's filled with drugs that will give us a hangover if we ingest them on a clean slate, on a clean system. So, Annie, those are my thoughts on that topic. It's a great question. Thank you for sending it in. And if you have a question you would like me to address on the weekly vlog, write to me. I'm at Susan@brightlineeating.com. I'll see you next week.